all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video, I'm going to be doing a build and review of the 1/72nd scale 1974 Hasegawa A6M5. So this is a rather old kit that I picked up secondhand for around about $10, so it was pretty cheap. And originally I was actually planning on selling it onwards, but I decided instead to take it as an opportunity to practice some techniques I hadn't tried before. So if you're looking for a video where someone builds this to a higher standard, then this might not be the one for you, but I do hope that this video can still help you out if you're interested in creating a nice chipped Japanese late war camouflage. So without further ado, let's get into it. I began this kit, as I always do, by first washing all the sprues in some warm soapy water to remove any oil and help the glue and paint stick, and then I cut out the fuselage halves and the kit's very basic tub, which included a moulded seat for its cockpit. As a small improvement, I decided to cut out a piece of polystyrene sheeting to make the instrument panel, use some spare bits of sprue to add the exposed machine guns, and a spare bit of fence post from an airfix control tower was used to make a joystick. The wings were also cut out and given a slight cleanup with my cutters, a file and also some fine sandpaper to remove the flashing, excess sprue and various other imperfections, and then the fuselage also got a bit of a cleanup with a knife to scrape away the flashing on it. I joined the lower and upper wing pieces together with some Revell Contactor professional glue and then clamped the parts together while they dried and began the long process of scribing all of the panel lines on the fuselage and the wings. My plan was to follow the original raised panel lines, which are included on the kit, with my Tamiya scribing tool, and then later sand all of the raised rivets and other details down, although this was easier said than done as some of the raised detail was very weak, and my scriber often slipped or accidentally got caught by the rivet details and not the actual panel lines. I experimented a bit by using a knife to try and etch a straighter line, and I also tried using some SMS panel scribing tape, but found it wouldn't stick to the model at all, probably due to the fine raised rivets, meaning there wasn't much surface for the tape to grip. In the end, it took me several hours over the course of several modelling sessions to finally scribe all of the panel lines in, and the wings were especially difficult due to all of these small access hatches and much finer details compared to the fuselage, and overall I found the Tamiya scribing tool was a bit too clumsy for some of these finer areas. For the much finer access hatches and panel lines, I tried using a small needle, but it wasn't very effective at scraping the plastic and scribing in the panels, so I have ordered a pointed scribing tool for next time. There was no landing gear bay interior included, so I decided to insert some polystyrene sheeting just as a basic floor to help hide the inside of the cockpit and prevent you being able to see through the landing gear bays. Before joining the fuselage halves, I decided to paint the very rudimentary included cockpit details. I first gave the tub and the sidewalls along with the rear area of the canopy several thin coats of Tamiya XF71 interior green until the colour was nice and uniform and I was happy with it. I then dabbed a small amount of flat black from Vallejo on the control columns along with some XF52 flat earth for the details on the guns. Although a decal was included for the instrument panel and it honestly didn't look too bad, as soon as it was dipped in some water it completely disintegrated. So I clearly wasn't going to be able to use the decals in this kit. So instead for the instrument panel I ended up just dabbing some black dots of paint onto it, along with some blue, white and red for some finer instrument details, before giving the seat a dry brushing of XF16 flat aluminium to add a bit of metal chipping. The fuselage halves were joined and fitted reasonably well together, and were held together with some masking tape and bulldog clips while the glue bonded and dried. I then set the model aside, and a few days later, when I felt like doing some more work on it, I removed the tape and continued with the long process of scribing. The panel lines on the fuselage halves didn't line up perfectly in every case, since I'd done the fuselage scribing before they'd been joined together, but for the most part the fit was alright. I did actually consider leaving the raised rivets included on this kit, but decided instead to take the chance to also practice a bit of riveting. For this, I first sanded away all of the raised details with some sandpaper on the wings and fuselage once all the panel lines had been scribed, and after dusting the model off and repeating the sanding with some gradually finer sandpaper, I then got out my trumpeter riveting set and began to slowly go over the marks where the rivets used to be. Following the old rivet lines was pretty inaccurate without any masking tape or guidance, and it was very challenging to get straight lines for the rivets, so that is something I want to improve on in the future. With the riveting finally done, I then glued the wings and fuselage together, and then repeated the scribing, sanding and riveting on a smaller scale with the horizontal stabilizers. This time though, I did experiment a bit with using some masking tape as a guidance, and found that it made it a little bit more accurate when riveting. I attached the horizontal stabilizers and then started to cut out the various engine parts, the landing gear, drop tank, and some of the finer parts included for the aircraft, such as the tail hook. Pretty much every part on this kit had some sort of flash or imperfection, so I spent a lot of time cleaning it up with a knife and some sandpaper. Once it had been cleaned up, the drop tank seemed to go together pretty well, and the landing gear, which consisted of a strut, a wheel and two fairings, after being cleaned up fitted pretty well. Although the fairings were a little bit fiddly and fragile, at least the main landing gear strut and wheels were pretty solid. The late Model Zeros had heat-proof plates installed behind the exhausts, which were originally modelled on this kit as raised panel lines, but I decided to sand them away and instead of rescoring them, glue some polystyrene sheets cut to various shapes behind the cowling while it was in place on the model to help line them up. Although frankly I found the fit between the cowling and fuselage was pretty poor. The engine required its centre hole to be drilled out with a cocktail stick for the prop to actually fit in it, but once this was done the aircraft was ready for some painting. It's pretty common for model makers to do late war Japanese aircraft with terribly chipped and worn out paint, which maybe is a bit exaggerated, and I have seen it confused with the Japanese tendency to also apply green over grey in a mottled style. However, it's fun to do a heavily chipped paint scheme for a change, and there certainly are examples of heavy weathering on Japanese aircraft. I wanted to use this aircraft as a guinea pig to try out some experiments to create some of these looks. My experimental chipping effect first required painting the aircraft so that its base coat was metal. To do this, I used some Tamiya AS12 bare metal silver, which is a spray can, since it gives a nice dull metal sheen and it would be a bit hardier and less prone to scratches than hand-painted acrylics. I sprayed around about 3 coats on the upper and lower surfaces, leaving several hours between each coat for them to dry, and once the final coat was done, I then left it for a full 24 hours for the paint to cure. Since the darker plastic had now been painted and was much lighter, the mistakes I'd made with the scribing and riveting tool were a lot more obvious, along with some other gaps. So I decided to take the opportunity to use a cocktail stick and some Vallejo water-based putty to fill in some of these gaps. The next step to creating the chipping was to add some liquid masking. For this, I used some rather foul-smelling Humbrol Maskol, which was dabbed onto the model using a brush which I was happy to sacrifice. I applied the Maskol where the chipping seems to occur most often based on reference photos, primarily in the area behind the engines, on the wings where the crews would walk, along access hatches, and on the leading edges of surfaces, and also in several spots along the fuselage. Humbrol recommends giving the Maskol about 20 minutes to dry after it's applied before painting over it, and then removing it within 48 hours, so I moved on to painting rather quickly. I started painting the lightest colour first, which would be the grey undersides. Continuing with the theme of experimenting, I tried some Vallejo Model Air 71298 M945 Grey, which was originally part of a Vallejo US Navy colour set. I figured it would be close enough to the grey used by late war Japan, although I had separately gotten 2 of the greens Vallejo include with their Imperial Japanese Navy colour set. While the first coat of grey dried, I painted flat black onto the cowling and the tyres, and off camera I tested one of the greens for the upper surface, which I'll talk about in a moment. I was happy with how the M945 Grey looked after the first coat, so I went ahead and applied a second one, before then addressing the green for the upper surface. I wasn't really happy with the first green that I tested for the upper surface, which was 71322 Imperial Japanese Navy Black Green, which as you can see was a little bit too light. Fortunately, the other colours suggested, which was 71325 Dark Imperial Japanese Navy Black Green, was much darker and a much better match for the late war Zeros. The Vallejo air paints overall seemed very good for brush painting. I found them to be consistent, and being designed for airbrushing, they are pretty thin out of the bottle, although they still benefit from a little bit of water to help thin them down. In total, I applied 3 coats of the black for the cowling and tyres, 3 coats of 71325 on the upper surface, and for the lighter undersides I had to do 5 coats of the M945 Grey. I used a finer brush towards the end of painting to neaten up any mistakes, and to apply several coats of flat yellow for the identification stripe on the leading edges of the wings. The yellow ended up getting about 4 coats since it's a rather light colour, and I was applying it over a dark green, meaning I needed more layers before the yellow became uniform. In several of the references I looked at, the Zeros seemed to have some panel variation on them, so I decided to try and replicate this by using a fine brush to apply some Tamiya XF58 olive green to create some lighter panels, mainly on the upper surface and also on the tail. Once I'd applied it and it was dry, I then painted a very thin coat of 71325 dark green over the top of it to make it a little bit more subtle. For the underside, and to create some extra painted over sections on the landing gear based on some references, I used some Vallejo Air 71121 light gull grey, which I applied in pretty much the same fashion, and then later painted over the top of with the base colour of M945 grey. With all of the painting completed, it was then time to apply a coat of Vallejo water-based gloss varnish with a large brush over the entire model to create a glossy surface for the decals and thus prevent them from silvering when they're applied. The Vallejo water-based varnishes can be applied with a brush and thinned with water, and I find that they create a very nice smooth finish quite easily, even in a single coat and with a brush. While the gloss varnish dries, which I usually allow at least 5 hours for, I painted the propeller spinner with some dark green and painted the propeller blades themselves with some Vallejo saddle brown. Since the decals had proven themselves to be unusable, I had to use some of my spares, which fortunately I had a few for the late model Zeros. I ended up going with a Zero registered ED126, not for any particular reason other than that it was a late model Zero in green and featured some interesting looking kill tallies on the fuselage. I cut out the decals I needed and then stuck them in some warm water, and once the transfers started to come loose, I slid them onto the model with a brush or in some cases my fingers. The aftermarket decals were a little bit fragile, but still of good enough quality, and went onto the model with only a couple of them tearing. I didn't have any spare walkway markings for the Zeros, but I did have the no touch for the controls and also the small red circle for the fuel caps. Once all the decals were on, I then applied some Vallejo decal softener with a cotton tip to all of them to make them soften a little bit and help them show more surface detail, and then I applied some Tamiya decal adhesive to help them grip more to the model. I left the decals to dry overnight, and the next morning applied a coat of Vallejo water-based matte varnish to give the decals and paint a more realistic and duller appearance, and once this had been left to dry for around about half the day, I then finally removed the Maskol using some blue tack to rub it away. Fortunately, all the Vallejo paints and varnishes were pretty hardy by this time, since I had to rub pretty hard to get the Maskol to come off. But as you can see, the result is what I reckon is a good chipped paint effect. I was pretty happy with these results from the Maskol, but the edges of the chipping were a little bit too blobby and circular. To give the paint a more natural distressed and create a more realistic chipped look, I decided to use a fine brush to apply a thin layer of paint over some of the chipping and especially around the edges. As you can see on the cowling, I used some Vallejo flat black and a fine brush to soften the chipping, and for part of the wings some flat yellow. I found that the Model Air paints were a little bit too thin out of the bottle, however, to use this technique with them, but I found that if I spread the paint out on the palette and then let it dry for a little while, it would start to thicken up and congeal a bit, and I could then dab it on to create the same effect and build it up in a few layers for the dark green and M945 grey. Eventually I was happy with the more subtle and more realistic looking metal chipping, so I then moved on to painting the finer details, such as the cannon barrels and engine XF16 flat aluminium, and Vallejo oily steel for the heat-proof plates behind the exhausts. The engine received some XF24 dark grey on the gearbox area, and the propeller received some metal chipping using a fine brush and some XF16 flat aluminium, before the rear cockpit was then painted with XF71 cockpit green, and as for the unusual Japanese bluish green for the wheel wells, I used some Vallejo 70808 blue green. The main landing gear struts were painted Tamiya X1 gloss black, and while they dried I gave the engine a coat of Tamiya black panel liner scent to darken it and highlight the cylinder details. I used some more flat yellow on the wing areas, and a little bit of vermilion red to repair some of the damage on the decals. Once the panel liner had dried, some flat black was used to pick out the raised engine details as well as to paint the tyres, before the exhaust pipes were then painted initially X33 bronze, but later on painted X31 titanium gold. After the paint had dried on the exhausts, they then received a brushing of some Tamiya rusting weathering powders from the Tamiya Master weathering set. I hand painted the yellow markers on the tips of the propeller blades with some flat yellow, before then gluing the engine into place along with one of the cannons which had fallen off during the painting process. For the canopy, I first painted it 2 coats of XF71 with a fine brush on the raised frames to create the interior colour, and while that dried I used white and black weathering powders to create a burnt exhaust effect coming from the exhausts on the fuselage sides. The canopy received several more coats, this time of 71325 dark Imperial Japanese Navy green, and then I cleaned up any mistakes I'd made with a cocktail stick by gently scraping off any of the excess paint that wasn't on the frames. Before attaching the canopy, I glued the antenna into place, and then since the antenna and the canopy fitted so nicely together, I decided to not bother gluing the canopy. A reasonably decent pilot figure was included, so I decided to have a go at painting him. I had to do a bit of surgery on his legs first though, so that he would fit, with the control column added, but eventually I managed to get him to fit into the cockpit. I used XF51 khaki drab for his uniform, which was painted in several layers, along with some XF52 flat earth for his life jacket and his helmet. While the paint dried on the figure, I also painted the included bombs several coats of X1 gloss black based on the instructions. I used Vallejo basic skin tone for the first coat of flesh on the figure, painted his boots with flat black, and his gloves XF9 hull red, before giving him a coat of flat earth on his helmet and his jacket for a second time. While the flat earth dried, I then removed the bombs from their sprues, and then gave his skin a coat of Vallejo dark flesh. The straps on him were painted with 70924 Russian uniform green, and as an extra touch I painted patriotic armbands for him using some white and red. After a few small touch-ups, some silver was painted onto his goggles to create the glass effect, and then I gave him a coat of panel liner which, once dried, was rubbed off with some X20 enamel thinners to remove the excess, and with the pilot and 2 bombs attached to the plane, the Hasegawa vintage A6M5 was finally completed. And here you can see the finished aircraft. As I mentioned, the intention with this kit was more to practice, fail and learn, but despite this and the somewhat old and basic nature of this kit, I still feel like I got a pretty good result. This kit was definitely a good practice for my scribing and riveting techniques, which I hope to definitely improve with some more practice. I didn't really find it all that fun to do though, so I probably won't be trying this with every vintage kit, but I can see with a bit more practice and control I could definitely improve some older kits with some recessed panel lines. I'm definitely happy with the weathering results I got using the Maskol technique, and I'm definitely going to be using this for some more heavy chipping effects in future builds. The Vallejo air paints were pretty good with the brush painting, and the Japanese colours I used seemed to me to be pretty authentic to the late war Zeros, and it also looks pretty good in my opinion, so I'm happy with them and will definitely be continuing to use them as well. I believe that Tamiya and Hasegawa are currently the only ones that do the late variant of the Zero in 1/72nd scale, but I could be mistaken and there could be plenty others. But old kits like this can still be fun to build and have their place, and this kit has definitely been a fun experiment and served its purpose as a testbed very well, and was a pretty good price for what it is. So that wraps things up for this build video, and although it wasn't the most professional, I do hope that it can still be useful for beginners and provide a little bit of inspiration. And I encourage anyone who's got a bit more experience than me to leave some suggestions in the comment section to help myself and other people improve. And if you did enjoy this video, please leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, it really helps out. A massive shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying kits like this and the products that I use. And the channel has reached over 2,000 subscribers, or at least before I put this video out it did reach that milestone. And I wish I had something a little bit better planned, but I didn't really think of anything, but thank you everyone for helping grow the channel to this much, and I look forward to doing plenty more videos and hopefully some more animations pretty soon. I'm sort of just working on some scripts. And before you miss out, head over to my community tab and vote on the next inbox review video, which I'll be doing soon, because voting will be ending a little bit after this video comes out if I time things correctly. Otherwise though, thanks again for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one. Until then, take care, and as always, model on.